Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to embark on our journey of the nervous system. This is going to be a very, very brief overview of the nervous system. We're only going to go through the most important aspects of it in order to understand the diseases that we're going to talk about. We are going to talk about one disease process, however, in this section that is usually um, saved for the cardiovascular system in most pathophysiology courses, but just because of how it lands, we are going to talk about it here instead. And that's the process of atherosclerosis when we talk about stroke, specifically a blockage in the artery, that type of stroke. There are other types of strokes that can happen where a blood vessel ruptures within the brain. The one we're going to talk about today is it's the one where an artery gets blocked. So when we talk about the nervous system, unlike the endocrine system that we talked about before last week, this is a rapid response, very quick changes to environmental stimuli or internal stimuli. It's because this is based on electrical impulses that try to communicate with one part of the body to another. This is a rapid response. When we think about the nervous system, we could actually separate it into two parts. There is the part that we refer to as the central nervous system. Sometimes it is the short form of it is CNS, and it includes only two components. It includes the brain and the spinal cord. The second part of the nervous system is something referred to as the peripheral nervous system. And this part of the nervous system, sometimes it is denoted PNS, although there is another um, part of the nervous system that is denoted PNS, so you have to be a little bit careful. This part of the nervous system contains the peripheral nerves, so we call those the spinal nerves, and the cranial nerves. Cranial nerves, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that exit through the skull. So there's spinal nerves that go to our limbs and the rest of our body, and then there are the cranial nerves that go into the face and head and neck region. When we look at how the nervous system communicates as a whole, there is the central nervous system, which is sort of the regulatory region of the nervous system, and there is input that happens. We're constantly checking the environment, checking our internal state to look for changes. These would be in the form of sensory stimuli. And so there are nerves that are specifically referred to as sensory nerves. So there are sensory nerves, and these would be in our periphery, part of our peripheral nervous system. These sensory nerves are sometimes referred to as afferent. Afferent. And they'll pick up stimuli. They'll send the signal to the central nervous system through the brain and spinal cord. And the brain and spinal cord will interpret what that signal is, what that stimulus is, and it will decide on a response. And it will give a response through a motor nerve, to the body to change whatever is happening. And so this would be motor. Sometimes this is called the efferent. Now, I say the words afferent and efferent differently on purpose so that you don't get confused, because a lot of people will say efferent, but it's hard to tell the difference between whether someone's saying efferent or afferent if you speak quickly. So I will always say afferent versus efferent, just to distinguish between the two. So the sensory nerve will pick up sensory stimuli. Oops, sensory. And this is through the somatic nerves. These somatic nerves are body nerves, the nerves within our body. These are either sensory, somatic, or the nerves within our special senses. So hearing, vision, taste, smell, whatever it happens to be. And those stimuli will get sent to the CNS, and then there will be some sort of a motor or efferent response. Now, that motor or efferent response is really dependent on the type of stimulus. They can either go through a somatic motor nerve. So that motor nerve could either be somatic, and this would go to the limbs or any of your skeletal muscles. So for instance, if say that there is a sensory stimulus that is a temperature stimulus, and say that you accidentally touch a hot element on the stove, that temperature stimulus will get sent through the spinal cord and will immediately create a response to contract the skeletal muscles so that you withdraw your hand away from that hot stimulus that can be harmful. These motor outputs could also be through the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system. And there's three arms to that. There is the sympathetic. This is also referred to as the fight or flight response. There is the parasympathetic. You know what I need to do? This is what I need to do here. I need to make this arrow longer so that I can actually write this parasympathetic. This is the rest and digest. And then there is a third arm of the autonomic nervous system that we refer to as the enteric nervous system. It's often forgotten about. This is going to control the GI function. Essentially, no matter what type of response we're looking at or what type of sensory input we have, the communication through the nervous system occurs through neurons. So the basic cell of the nervous system is a neuron. So these are going to communicate stimuli and outputs to various parts of the body. The way that they actually do this is through a process known as an action potential. And this is an electrical impulse, a change in voltage across a cell membrane. This is through action potentials. You've probably learned about action potentials before. I'm not necessarily going to go through all the ins and outs of action potentials, all the steps of action potentials. That's something that you can read about on your own. You probably already have a basic idea of what it is. But the real interesting thing about an action potential is that if you actually draw out the voltage that happens from an action potential in a neuron and the response that happens, you essentially have I'll just draw it out. That's fine. We'll sort of see here. This is the voltage. And this is in millivolts. And then this x-axis is time in milliseconds. And essentially, there's going to be when your neurons are at rest, there's a resting membrane potential. There's no change in the voltage across the cell. And that is approximately, the resting membrane potential is approximately minus 70 millivolts. When there is a stimulus, it causes the voltage to change because there are ion channels that open when a stimulus is detected. And so that's going to cause the membrane potential to change. And it actually causes a little bit of a positive deflection under most circumstances. Not always, but under most circumstances. And the thing about an action potential is that it is an all or nothing response. You either get an action potential or you don't get an action potential. Action potentials in general are the same magnitude no matter how strong a stimulus is. That's a very interesting concept here. So once you reach a particular threshold, that's these dotted line, you're going to reach a threshold potential. You will absolutely get an action potential, which is a spike in voltage. And that spike in voltage, it goes to approximately positive 30 millivolts. And then it comes back down fairly quickly, but it overshoots the mark a little bit. And you actually get a little bit of a more negative voltage than what you began with. And that would be the electrical impulse that would travel along. This entire thing would be the electrical impulse that travels along the neuron and eventually gets communicated with the part of the body that it's trying to send the signal of the stimulus to. So the real question here is if all action potentials, all or none phenomenon, so you either get an action potential or you don't. All action potentials, I'm going to say AP for action potential, are the same magnitude. So this actually brings up with it a bit of a problem in the nerve conduction because how does our body perceive whether a stimulus is more intense or less intense? We definitely can tell the difference between a more intense stimulus and a less intense stimulus. If there's something resting on your arm that is very light, you feel a little bit of pressure. But if you have a brick that's resting on your arm, you're going to feel a lot of pressure. If all action potentials are the same magnitude, how does our body tell the difference between the intensity of a stimulus? And there's a very important um, way that this occurs. And so the intensity of the stimulus, intensity of a stimulus is determined by the frequency of the action potentials. The closer together action potentials are, the stronger the stimulus. The further away they are, the further apart they are, the weaker the stimulus by the frequency. So I'll draw a little diagram here. So if we have this is going to be time. This is going to be action potentials that you're going to see. So um, whatever it happens to be. So this would be a weaker stimulus, weaker. You might get an action potential at varying lengths. So this would be weaker. And a more intense or a stronger stimulus will have action potentials that occur very quickly in quick succession to each other. And so the language of the action or the language of the nervous system is really around action potentials, but also the frequency of action potentials. So nerves communicate with each other by electrical impulses, but also the speed of those electrical impulses or the frequency really of those electrical impulses. Hopefully that makes sense. In addition to nerves, we actually also have supportive cells and protective cells within our nervous system. Actually, about 50% of the volume of our nervous system is actually all these supportive and protective cells. We call these neuroglial cells. Neuroglial cells. That's about 50% of the volume of the nervous system. These don't offer necessarily an electrical communication. These carry with it a supportive and protective function. And I'll talk a little bit about a few of the types of neuroglial cells. Sometimes they're just referred to as glial cells. I often just refer to them as glial cells, but they have different names or there are different types depending on whether you're looking at the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll give you a few examples. In the central nervous system, the most common neuroglial cell is something referred to as an astrocyte. And an astrocyte, this is the most abundant. They offer a supportive role, so they support the neural tissue. And it also plays a role in something referred to as the blood-brain barrier. The blood, I'm going to put this in capital, blood-brain barrier. Sometimes this is referred to as the BBB. The blood-brain barrier is actually quite an interesting area within the body. This is the region between the brain and the blood in the blood vessels. It's very hard to have things cross over the blood-brain barrier. Very few things actually cross. Um, and it's because the connections between the cells are so tight and there are very little gaps between them. Astrocytes play a role in that blood-brain barrier. Essentially, the only things that can really pass through are very small molecules and molecules that are hydrophobic. So those that dissolve in fat or oil-based molecules. Astrocytes are also going to help with chemical homeostasis in the central nervous system. In particular, they're going to help with potassium concentration regulation. They also may play a role in learning and memory. That's still up for debate a little bit. There is another type of neuroglial cell that is going to help with the conduction of action potentials across the nervous system. And the second type of cell that I think is important to talk about in the central nervous system is something called an oligodendrocyte. These cells make myelin. Now, you may know another type of cell that makes myelin, and we're going to talk about that type of cell, but it's not specifically in the central nervous system. The ones that make myelin in the central nervous system are very specifically called oligodendrocytes. This myelin has an insulating function, a protective function that helps protect neurons, um, but also helps speed up the conduction of an action potential. So it helps speed up action potential, and it protects the neuron. So I'll draw a picture of a neuron here. At one end of the neuron, there's these little sort of root-like extensions. And these little root-like extensions are called dendrites. And then there is a cell body with a nucleus on the inside. This is called the soma. And then attached to that cell body, there is a long cord-like extension that is called the axon. This is called the axon. That's where the action potential is going to travel along. And then at the very end of the neuron, there is a region here where there are these little axon terminals. And this is where the axon terminals are going to transmit the signal to the organ or the effector that is actually trying to receive the signal. That could be a muscle, that can be an organ, that could be part of the brain, that could be anything, another neuron. And the oligodendrocytes are going to produce this insulating fat-like substance that covers the neuron, but it doesn't cover it full. It covers the axon, but doesn't cover it fully. There are these little gaps in between where the covering doesn't fully cover. There's exposed regions of the axon. These little yellow areas are the myelin sheath. The myelin. It's going to protect, and it insulates this axon so that when you actually try to create an action potential that travels along it, the action potential doesn't need to travel along the entire axon. It can actually, the signal appears to jump from area that is exposed to area that is exposed, and it actually speeds up the conduction of the nerve signal. These little exposed regions of the axon are referred to as nodes of Ranvier. A neuron that doesn't have myelin doesn't conduct as quickly. So one of the things that is really going to affect the speed of conduction is the presence of myelin. There are conditions that actually destroy the myelin around your nerves, and nerve conduction can't occur as readily. One of the most notable examples of a demyelinating condition, or a condition that actually causes destruction of the myelin sheath, is multiple sclerosis. Causes destruction of myelin sheath, and therefore it slows down the conduction. People get neurologic symptoms, but these can be anything, because it can destroy any sort of nerve that is myelinated, and it slows down the conduction, and people start getting neurologic symptoms. Usually this occurs in the most heavily myelinated neurons, and one of the most heavily myelinated neurons that tends to be affected first are the optic nerves of the eye, and people will generally get either double vision, or they'll have a change in their color vision, um, and they'll get inflammation of their optic nerves. Okay, so that's um, our glial cells that exist within the central nervous system. Of the ones that exist in the peripheral nervous system, I think there's only really one that I'd want you to know about. Peripheral nervous system. It's the Schwann cell. You've probably heard of Schwann cells before. So these are glial cells of the peripheral nervous system. So this would also make up a good amount of the volume of the peripheral nervous system. And the Schwann cell is going to make myelin sheath. Myelin sheath in peripheral nervous system. So you may have heard about the Schwann cells before. Maybe you haven't really discussed the oligodendrocytes. They essentially do a very similar function, but just in different parts of the nervous system. So that's our introduction that we're going to have to the we're going to have an introduction to the um, sort of overview of the nervous system. And now we're just going to talk a little bit about some parts of the brain so that we're all on the same page and a little bit of the blood flow to the brain. Some of that is going to get into a little bit of nitty gritty with like names of arteries and all that sort of stuff. But it's one of the things that's going to help us understand stroke, essentially. So when we talk about the brain, we're going to mainly talk about the cerebrum. Cerebrum, specifically the cortex of the brain. This is the outer covering. If we were to look at a small segment of the cortex of the brain, we'll notice that it's actually folded. There's all these little folds in it. So I'm just going to show you like sort of a little, um, I don't know. Actually, it erased all of it. I'm just going to show you like a small section. This would come from the outer covering of the brain, and there's all these little folds. Now, if you were to look at the way that the actual arrangement of the neurons within the cerebral cortex, there's actually two regions, and they're slightly different color from each other. If you were to look at the brain, there's one that's a slightly darker color, and there's a slightly darker color along the most superficial parts of all these folds. And that slightly darker color we call gray matter. And gray matter makes up all of the cell bodies of neurons. So similar to these cell bodies that that I drew here, cell body. All those cell bodies are going to be arranged most superficially in the gray matter. So cell bodies. And then the rest of it has a whiter appearance to it, and that is going to be called white matter. Gray matter, white matter. And these are all of the axons of the neurons. So all the cords of the neurons are within the white matter. There are names given to the hills and valleys that exist within the brain. The hills are called gyri. I'm actually going to just put these in different color. So these are called, this is a gyrus or gyri for plural. So these are the hills. And then the little valleys are referred to as, it's referred to as a sulcus or sulci for plural. And there actually are a few regions within the brain that have these valleys that extend very deep within to the brain itself. And these are referred to as deep sulci. The deep sulci are also referred to as fissures. And the fissures are very important because they separate the lobes of the brain and the hemispheres. The halves of the brain, the left and the right half. And if we were to look at the brain itself from a top view, there would be all this sort of these folds that exist. This deep sulcus that exists between the left and right halves of the brain, this is called the longitudinal fissure. Now, the left and right halves of the brain are not completely separate from each other. There is a connection. There is a connection that exists between the left and the right half of the brain. And that connection allows for signals to be transmitted from the left and right side of the brain, and come up from the spinal cord and communicate with each other. And this is referred to as the corpus callosum. The two hemispheres are connected. So hemispheres connected by the corpus callosum. So they're not truly two separate brains. They do have a connection between them. We're going to look at one individual hemisphere of the brain and notice that it is actually separated into specific lobes. There are there are 5 lobes per hemisphere, but there's only 4 that we really talk about, and we're only going to talk about 4 of them. I'll tell you what the 5th one is, and you can look it up if you want to. So the lobes of the brain, lobes, um, there is, first one is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is really important in executive functioning. So this would be planning and decision making. It also has a primary role in motor function of skeletal muscle. Motor function of skeletal muscle. Within this motor function of the brain, there's also another region, which is referred to as Broca's area, and it's actually a language area, mainly for speech production. Broca's area, and this is for speech production. Broca's area is important because if somebody has a stroke to Broca's area, they won't be able to produce speech. They'll be able to understand what people are saying, but they won't be able to say anything back. So damage to this region means they can understand, but they can't communicate. Communicate. The frontal lobe also has an important function in personality and social behavior. People who start to have degeneration of their frontal lobe often have changes in personality, often have changes in social graces, social behaviors. And one of the, and sometimes this could be subtle. It could be a subtle change in personality that a person might notice or loved ones might notice, and that could indicate there's an issue with the frontal lobe. Second lobe that's important is something called the parietal lobe. And this is really important um, it's really important in sensory processing. It's really important in helping with spatial awareness. One of the major senses that we have is proprioception. Proprioception is an awareness of your body in space. If people have damage to their parietal lobe, they lose that ability to be aware of their body in space, and they would be um, quite at risk of falls and to lose their balance. It also plays an important role in computation and math. The third lobe is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is very important in audition or hearing. It's really important in memory and facial recognition. It has a language area that is referred to as Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is important for language comprehension. So people who have damage to Wernicke's area will have issues with understanding, but they'll be able to communicate. So they'll not be able to understand language, but they'll be able to communicate. They'll be able to produce language. Their language doesn't make much sense. There are a lot of errors in the language. They don't really produce goal-oriented thought. And they'll often have word salad. They'll just sort of be able to say words. They can communicate it, but when people speak to them, they can't comprehend what people are saying. When we think about the last lobe, or the last lobe that we're going to talk about, the occipital lobe, really one major function in the occipital lobe is whenever you think of occipital lobe, think visual processing. And perception. The last lobe of the brain that I think if you want to look up, you can. I'm not going to ask you anything on it. Just in case you're interested, is something called the insula. Let me try that again. Insula. Sometimes called the insular lobe. Insula. Look it up if you'd like, and you can learn some interesting stuff about it. If we were to actually look at a half of the brain, and we're going to look at a lateral view of half of the brain, I'm going to try my best to draw this. Yeah, that's about good enough. And I'm going to do this, and we're going to do that. Okay, that's good enough. Essentially, this is going to be anterior, or the front of the body. This is going to be posterior, or the back of the body. Well, the front of the brain is going to have the frontal lobe. So there's the frontal lobe. So I'm going to label that as F. The side of the brain consists of a couple of lobes. There is the parietal lobe, and there is the temporal lobe. And then right at the posterior aspect of the brain, there is the occipital lobe. Those are the four major lobes and sort of the approximate anatomical regions of each. You'll notice that I put a sort of hash marked structure just inferior to that, or posterior and inferior. This is referred to, this area of the brain, as the cerebellum. This is really important. This is really important in balance and coordination. If you're walking along the street and you accidentally hit your foot up against sort of a curb on the sidewalk and you almost fall over and you don't, your cerebellum is sort of taking over to help you not fall over. The cerebellum is really helpful in us doing rapid alternating movements. Rapid alternating. One of the tests that we do, and it might be hard for me to describe without any video or anything, is we get a person to turn their hand over. So if they'll put their left hand in their right hand, palms facing each other, and then they will turn their left hand to be palm up, and then they'll turn it again to be palm down, and they'll do that as fast as they can. That tests your ability to complete rapid alternating movements of turning your hand over and back up and over and back up. Somebody who has cerebellar dysfunction on one side won't be able to do that. And we test both sides. We test the left and we test the right. People who cannot do these rapid alternating movements, there's a term that is used to describe a lack of ability to do rapid alternating movements. So problems with rapid alternating movements is referred to as, it's a long word, it's called dysdiadochokinesia. Rolls right off the tongue. Dysdiadochokinesia. Just in case you ever read that term, people who have dysfunction of their cerebellum will often demonstrate dysdiadochokinesia, so an inability to complete rapid alternating movements. I'm going to talk a little bit about the blood supply to the brain. This gets into a little bit of nitty-gritty, but I think it's important to understand so that you can sort of understand if one of these arteries gets blocked, you can reference what lobe it might affect. And then if you know what lobe it affects, you might know the functions that might not be able to be done. So when we look at the blood supply to the brain has an interesting blood supply. The problem with the brain's blood supply is that every region of the brain generally only has one really good blood supply. If you block off that blood supply, that part of the brain will generally die. It's a very similar case for the heart. Every part of the heart, every region of the heart has an individual blood supply. There's not multiple blood supplies going to every part of the heart. If you block off that blood supply, that part of the heart muscle dies. It's kind of odd to think about because the brain and the heart are so vital, yet every region has only one very good blood supply. But then you look at something like your elbow, and your elbow has like 7 different blood supplies to it. You block off one, there's 6 others that can take over. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. You'd think that the more vital the organ, the more likely you are to have more blood supplies. But this idea of only having one blood supply, and if it gets blocked off, you lose that part for the brain and the heart, is demonstrated by the fact that the most common issues as we get older are with either brain issues, so with stroke, and with heart attacks. And those are related to blockages in the arteries that are around the heart and the brain. So the blood supply to the brain, to the brain. The first one is through the internal carotid arteries. There's a left and a right, left and right. And then there's a second pair of arteries that we call the vertebral arteries. And there is a left and a right. So I'm going to attempt to draw this out. This might not be a very pretty image, but there's a lot of there's a lot of branches to these arteries and all different names given to them. I'm going to give you all the names because the attempt is going to be to draw an image of what the blood supply looks like if you look at the undersurface of the brain. So we're going to start off with looking at these vertebral arteries. There's one on the left and one on the right. So you have a left vertebral artery and you have a right vertebral artery. And I'm just going to draw them as lines. And they're in red because anatomy books do these things in red. These vertebral arteries travel through the vertebral column on the left and on the right. And then they make their way all the way to the base of the brain. So there's the left vertebral artery, and there is the right vertebral artery. These connect together to make something called the basilar artery. Sometimes it's referred to as the vertebrobasilar artery. I just call it the basilar artery. And then the basilar artery is actually going to split into two arteries. The first one is going to go to the left side of the brain, to the back of the left side of the brain. So that's going to go off to the left side of the brain. Then there's one that goes off to the right side of the brain. The one that goes to the left is called the left posterior cerebral artery. And the one that goes to the right is called the right posterior cerebral artery. And then there's going to be an artery that is going to connect to more the middle part of the brain. And it's going to meet up with the left and right internal carotid arteries. So you kind of have to think about this in 3D, and it's coming up from the neck, but more from the anterior part of the neck. So there's these large arteries that are coming up from the internal part of the neck, the middle part, and it's meeting up with these extensions of those branches of the basilar artery. And they're going to send off branches. And they're actually, it's not really going to send off a branch. It's just going to be a continuation of the internal carotid artery. So this is the left internal carotid and the right internal carotid. And the extension of those are going to be the left and right middle cerebral artery. Artery. All of these are going to be arteries. I don't necessarily have to keep drawing the word artery or writing the word artery. And then this is going to continue, and it's going to send two branches to the anterior part of the brain, one on the left, one on the right. And these anterior ones, you can probably guess what these are. These are the anterior cerebral arteries. So there's the left anterior cerebral and the right anterior cerebral. There's going to be a connection between all of this. This middle connection here is a communication between the right side and the left side in the front. So this is called the anterior communicating artery. And the connection between where the middle cerebral artery is and the posterior cerebral artery is, these are the posterior communicating arteries. There's one on the left and one on the right. So there's the left posterior communicating artery, and there's the right posterior communicating artery. That's the main blood supply to the base of to the brain, the whole brain. What I want you to really pay attention to here, however, is that there is a circle connection of all of these arteries. That there is, even though it's not a great extra blood supply, that if one of the arteries gets blocked off, there's a connection between all of them in this little circle pattern. All of the arteries sort of communicate with each other. And this purple region that creates a circle is literally called the circle of Willis. I think there is another name for it that doesn't use somebody's name. I don't know what that is off the top of my head. no pun intended. But these are the arteries of the brain communicate with each other. So these are connections. If one blood supply sort of gets blocked off, there might be a little bit of blood flow to help out for a little while. It's not enough, but it can help out with a little while, for a little while. These types of connections in the body where there's multiple blood supplies that sort of connect together so that if one gets blocked off, the other one can sort of take over. These are called anastomoses. Most parts of the body have very robust anastomoses. The brain doesn't really have robust anastomoses. The heart doesn't have robust anastomoses. If you want to know, like, the main arteries here, there's the left cerebral, the anterior cerebrals, the middle cerebrals, and the posterior cerebrals. These are the six major arteries that we're concerned with when we think about what does each of these arteries supply within the brain. And so I'm just going to give you a brief overview. And actually, I should write out here that this is posterior, and up here is anterior, just to orient you. So if we look at the anterior cerebral artery, ACA, this is going to supply the medial frontal part of the medial frontal lobe and the parietal lobes. The middle cerebral artery supplies the lateral frontal lobes, the parietal, and the temporal lobes. And then the posterior cerebral artery is going to supply the occipital lobes and help supply the cerebellum. Essentially, that is the initial sort of anatomy / a little bit of the understanding of how the nervous system works. I'm going to stop there for now. And then in the next little presentation, I'm going to talk about the disease processes. Specifically, we're going to talk about stroke, specifically ischemic stroke, which means a blockage in an artery. And then we're also going to talk about the process by which an ischemic stroke actually comes about. What's happening within the blood vessel to cause it to get blocked off? And so we're going to talk about how does a process known as atherosclerosis occur. This is when we learn about atherosclerosis in this section, it's going to be an identical process that is going to happen in the arteries that are around the heart and throughout the body. So when we discuss atherosclerosis later in the course, you can think about the process that we talked about here. Until the next presentation, I will see you then. Bye, everyone.